Same joke as before, right? You don't sign up for a back okay, so what we're going to talk about today, and this is kind of the same group as the second session from yesterday. So you guys are a little bit bigger banks, a little bit more sophisticated. Not that you're better than smaller banks, but you know, sometimes you've dealt with a little more of some of these issues than some of the smaller community banks have. So you know, again, we're going to talk about primarily sort of strategies and processes when you're looking at maybe changing or transitioning to some different loss methodologies, you know, quantitative loss rate calculations, things like that. So it would certainly help. I mean, last time we had some pretty good discussion, so the pressure's on. You guys also need to have good discussion, and we were able to, you know, we hit the time pretty good. So if we want to, as we're going through, if you guys have gone through any of these things, I'm sure a lot of you have. You know, talk about sort of what worked, what didn't work, what struggles we had. Again, if you don't want to be interactive, that's just fine too, but probably a lot more. If you guys have seen any of our stuff before, I presented on loss migration, probably default loss given default a number of times. We're really not going to get like deep into kind of the nuts and bolts of how some of those alternative sort of calculation methods are actually done. We don't really have time for that. Primarily, what we're going to talk about today is you know, sort of the strategies and putting some of those processes in place and things to consider when you're looking at maybe making some of those transitions. If you're really interested in talking about kind of the nuts and bolts, I would encourage you to, you know, hit our YouTube channel for one thing, because we've got a number of those presentations out there, as well as, you know, feel free to talk to me after or whenever you want to, and we can talk more about that. So mostly this will be kind of, like I said, process, strategy, stuff like that. So we called it transitioning loss methodology. So first things first, make sure that's what we're talking about. So we're talking about the quantitative portion of your allowance, right? The loss rate calculation. You know, what you're applying to your loan pools for your baseline calculation before your adjustments to calculate that loss rate. So we're going to look at three main things here. So kind of why would you consider a change in loss methodology? So there's a variety of different reasons. We'll kind of go through a few of them. Again, if you guys have, if any of you have sort of switched from one methodology to another, you know, what kind of drove that switch and why did you make the decisions? What might be changed? So are we looking at a complete overhaul? Are we going to throw away our old loss methodology and sort of build a new one? Or are we going to just sort of tweak some things, tweak some parameters within our existing loss methodology? Then how can we go about executing? So what are some of the actual hows? What sort of pre-steps do we need to take? And what are some you know, strategies for kind of implementing a change like this? So these will be the three main points we go over, kind of the why, what, and how here. So first, let's talk about the why. So for many people, you know, you're probably happy with the loss methodology you're using. Regulators are happy, auditors are happy, senior management is happy. Why would we possibly want to change? I actually had FDIC not. You guys didn't sneak in here too, did you? So we had the FDIC in the last one. So I don't mind mentioning it since they're not in this one. Sometimes people change their loss methodologies because they're encouraged to from external sources, right? Sometimes we hear regulators encouraging it. Sometimes we hear external auditors encouraging it. So that's one of the potential reasons why you might want to change. That's probably not the best one because you'd much rather have that change be driven internally than externally most of the time, but that is a potential. Some of the internal reasons are you want more accuracy and reactivity within your allowance. So usually what I'm talking about here, when I'm talking about changing methodologies, we're looking at, you know, kind of a homogeneous historical loss perspective versus some type of migration analysis versus some type of probability default loss given default calculation. So if you think about those as sort of the three steps up the complexity ladder for quantitative methodologies, and there's a lot of variations within there. You know, as you go up the steps, you're sort of getting more accurate, or hopefully more accurate at each sort of step of those calculations. Again, if you're looking at purely at a homogeneous level within a given loan type or sort of loan segment, then you're really, that can mask a lot of sort of the underlying characteristics of that pool. As you sort of step up the ladder, you're getting more granular, you're digging down, and it can both react better to changes in the underlying credit metrics, or you know, like I said, be more accurate for what actually exists within that pool today. The example I usually talk about is if you're looking at a homogeneous loss calculation, you know, you've got a CRE loan that downgrades from a 5 to a 7. Does anything change about your allowance due to that downgrade happening? In many cases, the answer is no. Now, you may say, well, we'll adjust our qualitative factors, you know, we'll look at our downgrade, that sort of thing. But does anything quantitatively happen? And in many cases, the answer is no. And it's not that that's the wrong approach, but that's just maybe something you want to take a look at. This is a big one. So preparing for CECL. So we've talked a lot about CECL yesterday and today. As you're looking towards CECL, it may help you start building some of these, not necessarily what will ultimately be your CECL model, but start building some of the underlying structure of what may become your CECL model. You may not know everything that you need to know now, but again, getting a sort of head start on that instead of waiting until the last minute and then you discover that you don't have the data or you haven't done some of the things ahead of time that you need to do. As well as, and this kind of goes to the top one, increased granularity and directional consistency. I talked about sort of the downgrade within a loan leading directly to some sort of change in the allowance, or a loan moving to a delinquent status, triggering a change in your allowance, or even things like loan to value changing, triggering some sort of change in your allowance. So these are some of the reasons, like internally, this may be something you want to think about. Again, external forces could be at play as well. We'll start the discussion here if anyone's going to be willing to do it. And for anyone who has sort of shifted from one quantitative methodology to another, did you guys have sort of one or two particular reasons that made you want to go that direction, or just decided to flip the coin?
We're getting ready to change. We're getting ready to change from a migration analysis to a PD-LGD, and one of the reasons why we're doing it is to be consistent with our DFAST testing, because we are a $16 billion bank, so we're going to have to submit a credit stress test, and we use a PD-LGD approach for stress testing, and we want to be consistent and leverage H-ball and stress testing.
Sure, absolutely. Anybody else who's no one's ever changed? Everyone's shy. I know this is we're pretty deep in presentations here today, so appreciate you speaking. All right, so let's talk about what you might actually change. So Charity brought up one of the biggest things that you might change, and that's really looking at the fundamental sort of type of quantitative methodology you're using. Right? So again, I sort of talked about kind of the 3 steps, and again, that's not a comprehensive list. There are other sort of matrix models and other stuff that you could be using, but those are really a lot of what we see. It's sort of the homogeneous historical loss, some sort of migration, and then moving up to maybe a more complex PD-LGD model. Now, this is pretty much the biggest change you can make, because in this case, you're really saying throwing our other model away, or not using a large component of it to then really change to a completely different strategy entirely. So this is one of the bigger changes, but it is one of the more common ones. And Jerry brought up a good point. If you are subject to things like DFAST stress testing, then it can be useful to, rather than doing a PD-LGD over here and then doing something else over here that looks a lot like a PD-LGD, sort of combining those processes to the best you can. So that may not apply to a lot of you, but it does apply to you now. You might find that it applies to you tomorrow when you wake up. So pooling structure. So this is a smaller change, but you may want to look at sort of, many people just, your segments for your loan pools, your Fast 5 pools are very much sort of a set it and forget it kind of thing. We set them 10 years ago in some cases, and we've never really reanalyzed them. We've never looked at, are some of these changing? We had one bank in particular who had a pretty large bank, and one of their loan pools comprised well over 40% of their portfolio. And in that case, you may want to look at, okay, is there some subsegmenting that needs to happen here, because there's probably, these loans are probably not homogeneous at this point. There are probably some characteristics that may change them from each other. So something to think about. So if you are going to drill those things down, that can cause some challenges depending on how you're doing your analysis. If we want to drill it down by maybe some metrics that we haven't been using before, or haven't been tracking previously. So if we say we're going to break our C&I portfolio down by a NAICS code, well, do we have NAICS code historically? Can we understand what loans had particular NAICS codes historically, or are we going to have to start sort of from ground zero with that? So don't always take for granted that the changes you want to make are available within your data. Really make sure that you understand what you have and what you don't have. And again, we'll talk about this a little later. The data you have now may define what you have the capabilities to do 3 or 4 years from now. So you want to try to be a little bit forward-looking with some of that stuff, and that way, no one has a crystal ball, right? There's no way to know exactly what decisions you're going to make 3 or 4 years from now, but you may wish you had some things that will then, at that point, no longer be available. And then this is kind of the simplest change, just looking at variables in your current loss methodology. So maybe we're not interested in sort of throwing away what we're working on now, but we are interested in making some smaller changes. Maybe we want to, and we'll talk about some of the specifics within there, but there may be kind of some knobs we want to turn, some tweaks we want to make within our loss methodology. So what types of loss methodology? Let's take a survey real quick. So how many of you guys are doing what I would call sort of a vanilla, kind of homogeneous loss approach, where you're really just looking at, sort of net charge-offs over balances on a quarter-by-quarter basis?
Yes.
All right, so we got a few of those. How many of you guys are doing some sort of what I call loss migration, where you're looking at losses and then you're sort of tracking those back through time? Okay, and how many of you guys have done a probability of default loss given default approach? Okay, so we've got a little bit of all three here. So yes, you guys are sort of at various points along the continuum. Again, I don't want to, when I'm talking about the sort of ladder concept of moving up the complexity ladder, that doesn't mean that the top is where you always have to be, right? That might not be the appropriate place for your institution, but just know that there are, some different options out there. So loss migration, we'll sort of define both of these terms. I didn't list homogeneous loss history calculations, I think everyone sort of knows what that is. But loss migration, a probability of default plus a loss given default. Anybody using anything else? Anything we haven't really talked about? No? Okay. So loss migration, just sort of a definition of terms here. When I'm talking about loss migration, generally what I'm looking at is calculation of loss rate. I'm just going to read this. Calculation of loss rates based on the migration of losses back to the history of the loan to assign those losses to the risk stratified segments the loan has existed over the previous year. Allows for the granular calculation of loss rates based on risk characteristics. So the way this calculation is done is obviously substantially different, kind of a homogeneous historical loss approach, and primarily due to this, so that you're looking at homogeneous, again, all the same, all being treated the same, right? We're looking at these based on some sort of risk stratified characteristics to understand what are the differences in risk between maybe a 2 graded loan and a 5 graded loan, or a 4 graded loan and a 7 graded loan. Understand quantitatively what those differences in loss risk are. Again, we know qualitatively, we know there's some sort of increased risk there, and this is just sort of a way to, got it handled, right? Yeah. We know there's some sort of increased risk there, and this is really just a way to sort of quantify that so we kind of understand it a little better. Probability of default, loss given default. So there are so many different approaches for probability of default, loss given default that I sort of realized I've sort of abstracted this definition to almost meaning nothing. Basically, I'm saying it's the calculation of the probabilities of defaults and losses given default. But basically what it comes down to is taking you're still going to use as part of your sort of loss rate methodology. It's still going to ultimately come down to a loss rate. But this is really just dividing it into its kind of component parts. So if you think about the losses that you have at your bank, they're comprised of sort of two things. The probability that a loan will default at all, regardless of what its loss will be, the fact that it will default and it will have some sort of loss, the loan will not perform according to its contractual terms. And then we have the losses given default, so the losses that are associated with those loans after they experience those default events. So in some pools or in some scenarios, you may have very low probabilities of default, but say it's an unsecured pool, very high losses when you do have those default events, right? Because there's not a lot of collateral. You may have some pools where you have the reverse. Maybe you have a lot of defaults, but it's a well collateralized pool, and you have very low losses that are actually associated with those defaults. So just sort of breaking it out into separate parts. A few advantages to that, and Charity brought one of them up. In terms of stress testing, a lot of times probability of default and loss given default are sort of inputs for a lot of the stress tests that are out there. So this is a way to sort of leverage what you're doing in one place to be done in another place, rather than sort of having all these different independent things going on. All right.
Sorry, that's a question.
Yes.
Since we don't do LG, but my question is, how do you know what your probability of default is? I mean, without doing a migration analysis, I don't expect, right?
Right. So I would call at least most of the probability of default calculations we do are based on some kind of migration. So the term like loss migration versus migration analysis, like I think migration analysis is sort of a holistic term combining usually like loss migration and probability of default, loss given default migration. But some people use that in different ways. But yeah, you would do it's going to be some sort of migration-based analysis generally there are some PD models that look at, more sort of economic things and stuff outside. But I think for most people who are doing it for their allowance methodology, it's going to be based on your historical data and the migrations of those loans to those sort of risks stratified.
And it's just saying with the loss given default, right? It's going to be based on your history of losses for a particular asset type, I would think.
Generally, yeah. So, yeah, if you think about it like, on a pure mathematical basis, right? And this is really a simplification, but so right now, again, this is a way simplification. But right now, your loss rates are basically like net charge-offs over balance, right? That's kind of what it breaks down to. However you sort of aggregate those things or slice and dice, that's really what it breaks down to. So for most people, for a probability of default, loss given default, probability is sort of the balance of loans that ultimately defaulted over balance, or you could do count. We do have some people who do probabilities. Folks who do probability of default, you do it by count or by balance for the probability.
Count.
Count? Balance? Okay. Most of the time you see it done by count if you have like some sort of large homogeneous portfolio where the balance doesn't matter. Most community banks, you're going to do it by balance because you're sort of weighting the big defaults versus the small defaults. So anyway, the balance of defaulted loans over sort of the total balance in the pool, that's going to give you sort of your probability of default. And then for your loss given default, you're sort of looking at the net charge-offs over those defaulted balances. So if you think about it like in terms of converting that back to a loss rate, right? This sort of eliminates this, right? The defaulted balance sort of like comes back, washes back out of the calculation to get you back to kind of the same place you were, but you're dividing it up into those individual parts for better analysis, more granularity. So that's the way simplified explanation of that. So.
Is default generally goes non-accrual? That's a.
Yeah, I would be interested because this is a point of contention for you guys.
No.
I made you raise your hand earlier, so I'm going to keep pointing at you when you talk about probability of default, loss given default.
We define default as when we determine that a loan is impaired. So it's either a non-accrual or a TDR, or we don't expect to collect the contractual, based on the contractual terms. So we don't have a lot of payment defaults, because we do have some very large commercial loans. So payment default doesn't really tell us anything because it's too late. We look at financial default.
Sure. Anyone else use a definition inconsistent with that? We have seen some probability of default, loss given default models that, some of it depends on the bank's philosophy. We have seen some PDLG models that really just uses the first dollar of loss as the default also. It sort of simplifies things a little bit, so we sometimes see people doing that where they'll just say, as soon as the loan has any loss at all, that's the default, and then we'll look at what your loss given default is. But yeah, move to non-accrual, move to OREO without sometimes there's not a loss, it just moves directly to OREO. Anything else? Anything missing? Okay. All right, so what if we wanted to change the pooling structure? What are some of the reasons why we do that? Like I said, you haven't looked at it in a long time. This is increased granularity. Now, there's always a balancing act with your pooling structure, right? There's the granularity over here, and then there's the statistical significance of your data over here. We've got banks who sometimes exist on both ends of the spectrum, where we've got maybe not enough pools, or maybe way too many pools. You might be a $1 billion bank that has 5 pools, that's probably not enough. You might be a $1 billion bank that has 500 pools, that's probably too many. So, you've got to sort of find the balance of what truly makes these loans similar or dissimilar, and can we group them in those ways? And, there's a few different strategies for doing that kind of thing, but you do want to put some thought into it, especially, like I said, it's something you haven't looked at in a long time. Regional breakouts, I wouldn't say that a lot of banks do this. If you're sort of concentrated, even if it's a geographic area that may spread over 2 or 3 states, it may not be appropriate to do regional breakouts because those economies may be fairly similar. But we've got some banks who have, Los Angeles portfolios, Texas portfolios, Illinois portfolios, New York portfolios, right? Those economies are probably not similar, and those lending groups are probably completely separate. So, in those cases, you may want to treat some of those as more regional. You still have to play the same balancing act. If I slice my pools too thin, then I suddenly don't have any sort of viable data to work with, and it's ultimately not going to lead to a very, very good result. So, yes.
Too thin. What kind of guidelines do you give?
You would ask that, wouldn't you? So this is sometimes I answer this question like the sort of Supreme Court thing about pornography, right? You don't know what's too thin, but you know it when you see it, right? And some of it depends on, and in cases where we found that the data really ended up too thin, it was once we'd sort of run the analysis, and then you see that the loss rates are just, so lumpy as to be useless, or can don't really mean anything at that point. If you've got a pool with 20 loans in it, 2 of them default, well now you have a nice big default rate. Does that really mean anything when it's a relatively small portion of it? So it's hard to really say, and that's a bank by bank decision also. I mean, what's a small pool for a community bank is not a small pool for Citibank, right? It's a totally different set of information. So, and that's one of the challenges community banks face, because you always have this, you're always going to have less data to work with than the big boys, right? We worked with a finance company one time, and it was the most beautiful loss curves you've ever seen, because they had like thousands and thousands and thousands of transactions coming through, and it was just, everything just went out so smoothly. And we find in community banks that's not always the case, right? Sometimes it's lumpy, things jump up and down. So you do have to sort of use some management judgment there. It's not I don't want to say single right answer. And then risk-based gratification. So, this most commonly is, risk grades. We all familiar with risk grades, but it may not be, especially in pools where risk grades aren't commonly done or aren't done accurately or until something really bad happens. So you may want to base these on something like delinquency, have people look at FICO scores as triggers, or even a move to non-accrual can sort of define a pool in a different way. So a couple of potential options there. All right, so variables in your current loss methodology. So this is a pretty simple one. I mean, most people I think can do this without changing too much stuff, but if you're looking at extending or shortening your look back period, they were calling it the loss accumulation period. We've got a lot of different terms. I think every accounting firm has come up with their own different terms for these things. So I'm going to keep using look back period because that's what we've been using for a while. But, so if you're going to extend it, you're going to shorten it. This is a relatively easy change for most people to do, right? You just sort of change it to sum of 8 to sum of 12 or whatever it is, right? But it is something that you may want to put some thought into, and may even want to kind of look at for a couple of quarters before you actually pull the trigger, just to make sure that it's having the intended effect, rather than just making a decision and then the very next quarter wishing you had made a different decision. Reevaluation of your loss emergence period. Again, loss discovery period, same thing. And this, again, we've sort of beat this horse this week, so I don't know if we'll talk about it a lot more. But that's another potential change in your methodology, and another thing that you want to, would want to put some thought into before you necessarily just sort of slap into your model. Okay, so let's talk about how. So this is when we get to this point, the data, this is, I feel like I go over this in every single presentation I do, right? The single most important thing you can have is the data available to make some of these changes. Whether you think we're perfectly happy with our quantitative methodology, we're not going to change it, we don't even think we'll have to change it for CECL. Again, you might find yourself 4 or 5 years from now wishing you had made a different decision now. I don't know that there will be anyone now who says, I'm going to start working on sort of retaining some of this data, that will in 4 or 5 years think, well, I wish I hadn't been retaining that data, right? It's almost kind of a no downside thing. So there's no reason not to do this. And again, I feel like I'm beating this drum over and over again. It's very important, especially with CECL. Buy-in from stakeholders. So, when we're thinking about changing quantitative loss methodology, at MST we always try and encourage, and I know sometimes these relationships are different, kind of open lines of communication with your auditors, with your regulators, with senior management, to understand, what you don't want to have to do is sort of go far down the road towards a different quantitative methodology before you talk to some of these other folks, and then discover, oh no, they're actually not going to buy off on this at all. They're going to get serious pushback on this. So even if you're not sort of telling exactly what you're doing or giving a time frame, sort of bring it up, saying, well, we're considering this. What do you guys think about this? So again, sometimes those relationships are different than others, but it's always better to sort of have those people informed early on. And then this is a concept that we had a white paper come out about relatively recently that we've sort of talked to some folks about that, and this is sort of a play on shadow accounting, right? So shadow loss methodology, where you've got shadow accounting, right? We sort of got the customer balance, we've got this forward-facing balance, but kind of behind the scenes, we're making charge-offs, we're applying non-accrual interest principal, that sort of thing. Same sort of concept, right? So we're we're not gonna change our current loss methodology that our official loss methodology for allowance purposes right now. We might not change it for several quarters, we might never change it. But what we're doing is we're sort of kind of running an additional kind of quantitative methodology just to sort of look at, you know, how those things might be changing. We'll sort of go over a little bit things you might want to look at for a kind of a shadow loss methodology. The data. So what kinds of data? I feel like, again, I've sort of shown this slide quite a few times. Mostly what we're talking about is this, the loan level data. I'm amazed by the number of banks who are not retaining this, although I think it's started to change a little bit now. And we were working with a bank the other day who wants to do a 20-quarter migration. They can only get 4 quarters worth of data. So, you know, that means they're either going to have to pay someone to try to get some of this data for them, or basically wait 4 years before they can do the 5-year analysis they want to do. So, you know, again, there's no real downside here. It takes very little time. It doesn't have to be a complicated process with a data warehouse. This may be as simple as running a loan tape and saving it somewhere. That's really all it might take, and you'll be better off having this information. And what kind of data? So, you know, you want to be able to know, and again, this sort of goes back to that crystal ball thing. If we feel like we might segment our loans differently 3 years from now, we need to make sure we've got those fields now. And even if they're not being tracked now, we might want to start thinking about tracking some of them now. Same with those risk indicators. Understanding what balance is obviously, and then the loss or default bits. So, you know, transactional loan level charge-off and recovery information. So not GL level, but down at the individual loan, so we can really track those things back to the lives of those loans. And then segment level data, I bring this up because sometimes you can sort of piece together some of the loan level data. If you've got loan level data, segment level data shouldn't be a problem because you can aggregate it up, obviously. But you know, there may be some cases where you need to sort of create some of this data manually, and you still need to have this feedback. So again, take away nothing else. Data, data, data. Okay. All right. So shadow loss methodology. So again, this is kind of something that we know banks have done this. I mean, you might think about it as sort of running parallel, but in running parallel, you're sort of definitely moving to this thing, right? You're definitely moving to this thing over here, and we're running both, and then eventually we're just going to stop running this one. This isn't necessarily running parallel. This is sort of just using this as an additional, I like the term the economists use, additional tool in your toolbox, right? So you may look at some reserve coverage ratios, and this may be just sort of an additional tool in your toolbox. It doesn't have to replace your existing quantitative methodology, especially if that's something that a lot of people are, you know, sort of happy with. But it may be, it may have some different assumptions, or be a completely different methodology, just sort of as a secondary item. See, there's a real word for this. I didn't make this up. I was brave enough to put model or models here. Anybody run like 3 or 4 quantitative models? You could, I guess. So what are some of the reasons we might want to do this? First, you can run as a check, and I think that's sort of the reason that Charity is pointing to. So, you know, if you're running your existing quantitative methodology, and you're also running this one over here, what if they come up with radically different answers, or even slightly different answers, or they start trending in different directions? What does that tell you? You know, is something wrong here? Is something wrong here? Is one or more of them, one of the models reacting to something the other one's not, or vice versa? So, you know, to give you some sort of additional checks, there's some things you may want to look at. Again, you may not change anything based on that. It just gives you additional information about what's going on in the portfolio. It can serve as support for some of your qualitative factors. So usually what I'm talking about here, a couple of main things. If you've got a qualitative factor for sort of risk rating migration, or qualitative factor for, you know, sort of the risk ratings of within a given portfolio, you know, and you're running sort of a migration analysis on the side, that can kind of support some of that information. You can sort of show how those things are migrating. Same with if you were running like a PDLG model, and you have a qualitative factor for sort of changes in collateral values. You know, if you can see how the losses given default are changing on some of these pools, then you can see, all right, well, maybe we need to make some sort of qualitative adjustment there. It might give you a little more support for some of those things. And it can help you prepare for CECL. So, again, we've sort of beaten the CECL drum all week, which I'm sure everyone just loves to hear more about CECL. But I mean, it is true that, you know, a big part of CECL may be a change to your quantitative methodology. And if you're able to start running sort of a side methodology, a shadow methodology that it's not necessarily full CECL compliance, it's at least moving in that direction. You're gonna have a leg up on these other banks that are not necessarily doing anything. And suddenly when CECL comes out, we got an implementation period and they're going to be sort of scrambling to try to figure some of these things out. So that's one thing you may want to consider, even if it's, again, final CECL guidance is not out yet, but I think we've got pretty good ideas what it's gonna look like. And like I said, the change in your quantitative model will be a piece of that. So another thing here, in extreme cases, if you sort of were able to kind of build a quantitative model that you felt like would ultimately be your CECL model, that can assist with capital planning, understanding how your allowance is gonna need to change once CECL is actually implemented, and might can position you better, going down the road. All right, so we've kind of covered what we want to cover here. We've got about 10 or 15 minutes. You guys are quiet again. So, any additional discussion, any questions? Anybody who's gone through this process?
Well, I was just curious from a conceptual point of view, for someone who's using a PG-LGD approach, currently we're using a 1-year probability of default, typically underlying each loan grade, depending upon the loan grade, would have different probability of default.
Sure.
Moving to a CECL model, does that necessarily imply that you have to change all those probabilities of default or some kind of cumulative probability, depending on the loan life? I mean, do you have to jettison what you're using now and go to a different set of probabilities?
I don't know that you have to jettison it. I think you can use that as a component, but yeah, I think the 1-year look that you're going to be looking at there will not necessarily be sufficient, right? Because just looking back a year is not necessarily going to, you need to be able to look back farther than that to sort of the origination of these loans, the life of these loans to understand. Because the default, when you're looking at a year slice, you're saying, well, it couldn't have been farther back than here when this default was actually incurred essentially within this loan. But under a CECL model, you're going to need to be able to look back much farther than there. So I think you've at least got the building blocks for what might ultimately look like there. But I think you're going to have to look over longer periods. The guys from Grant Thornton talked about a cohort approach, which is kind of what you're doing now, except for looking forward much farther and looking at a lot of those different periods sort of all together. So you get some of the longer looking forward periods than just a year. Again, the CECL stuff's not entirely settled, but we feel like that we've got enough information now that we think that's kind of the direction that some of those things are going.
Yeah, we generally believe that as long as life of loan or life of portfolio comes up there, you can't really avoid it. You have to run those cohorts out through the life. So I don't know, when you're talking about the low, like a special mention or substandard, whether it's going to change that rate very much, it's hard to say.
Yeah,
but the rest of it, you just have to support it though. That's the thing.
Yeah, I know. And this is an anecdote. Some of you guys who may use our migration methodology now, whether it's loss migration or probably default, loss given default. One of the things that we've done with a couple of clients, and we may actually do it some more before CECL actually comes out, is we have this concept called sort of a defined loss horizon within our migration. I don't know how many of you guys are actually using it, but a few of you are. So a defined loss horizon. So and within our migration, it's sort of like how far back that loss goes, into history. And it sort of represents your loss emergence period, right? So how far back into the history of this loan was this loss already incurred, right? That's sort of the concept. And so what we've done with a few people is sort of, all right, what happens if we just remove that restriction, right? If we just say there's no defined loss horizon, we're going to let this go back all the way. And you're right, what generally seems to happen is the loss rates on substandard loans, maybe even special mention loans, don't change a whole lot.
Yeah, it's either going to get better or worse, right?
Right.
They either go under or they get better.
Yeah, so, but it's the past loans. It's the past loans where that's where you're going to end up having probably significant increases in those.
Yeah, which might argue for more segmentation, not just past, but 3, 4, 5.
Exactly. Yeah, and that the segmentation decisions like that, a lot of that's based on attendance of pools, size of the bank, how sticky your past past grades are. Sometimes loans don't really migrate through the past grades; they just sort of sit until they go much farther down. So sometimes we've actually done the analysis, drilled all the way down with a particular bank. He's not in here, where they drilled it down to individual past grades. They had a 2-grade construction loan. It's the only one they'd ever had, and they defaulted. So, sometimes when you drill down that far, you find that you end up with not enough information. So, anyone else? Anyone else? used change methodologies ever, considered it? We've got a couple more minutes, I think, before we're done, so I'm gonna have to like start telling jokes, or do you guys want to talk?
I do have a question
Sure.
on, when we're doing trying to consider collateral values, for the EAD. Does it more come through a, kind of a qualitative adjustment sort of thing, or how does it, I mean, how is it, I guess, how do you quantitatively or put it into the system, or how that,
So if we were gonna use the, like, the LGD component
Yeah,
for
yeah.
qualitative support, yeah, I mean, I don't, that was sort of something we come up with, and it's one of those things where, I mean, right now, I don't know about a lot of you guys, but a lot of people, qualitative adjustments are, the support's very light for those, right? In some cases, it's non-existent. So it wouldn't necessarily be, kind of the be-all, end-all, but it might give you a better indication for when those adjustments need to start being made, because you may not necessarily know that some of those underlying collateral values are actually dropping. Again, if you're in that sort of looking at total loss rates, that's sort of muddled together with the probabilities of default, so without being able to parse those out, you don't necessarily know. I mean, somebody in the bank might know, but you're not really looking at it that closely, sort of how those things are changing. So it might not be that it would give you a direct number for how much to adjust that qualitatively, but more a magnitude for, is this changing, if so, how much?
The one thing that we've done is we asked MST to add a collateral dependent flag for us. So when we have an impaired loan and when we do the valuation analysis and we said it's collateral dependent, we can flag that, and then we can start to track, where our collateral dependent loans are trending and which loan segments we have more collateral dependency in.
do you have loans that are non-impaired but collateral dependent?
If they're non-impaired, then we consider whatever source of repayment is there as adequate. So
Right.
even if that is based on the collateral, it's based on, you would do some condo loans where it's based on the sale of that collateral. But as long as they're under their business plan to
Yeah.
sell that collateral, then it's.
No, I understand. I just didn't know if if you would, for all intents and purposes, kind of estimate an allowance based on, like, as though it was, collateral dependent.
I mean, collateral dependency is one of the 9 considered key factors.
Okay.
So in areas where, in loan segments where there is more collateral dependency, we do add a qualitative factor.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah, it's one of the 9, the magical, risk center agency policy that everyone uses as the Bible for what their qualitative factors should be. So. Any other questions, comments? No? Okay, well, you guys are good then, and I guess you get a little bit of a head start on our next break. Feel free, I think we've got, right, I'm not making that up. Ready,
There is a break.
3:30.
3:30.
15-minute break.
You guys get a head start.